Hey everybody, I'm Zoe.
And I'm Chandi.
And this is Bound by the Cloak.
When most of us hear the word asbestos, we think of old buildings containing cancerous, hazardous materials. But the story behind asbestos is much darker. There were quite a few law firm commercials in the 90s and early 2000s reaching out to patients or loved ones of those diagnosed with illnesses like mesothelioma. Once thought to be an extremely versatile material, asbestos is now known to be insidiously dangerous.
For decades, companies knew it was deadly, yet they kept mining it, selling it, and putting workers at risk. In his latest book, In a Rain of Dust, Death, Deceit, and the Lawyer Who Busted Big Asbestos, David Kinley tells the story of how one company, CAPE Plc, exploited men, women, and even children in South Africa, and how a lawyer named Richard Meeran fought back to bring them to justice. David joins us today to talk about what asbestos really is, how it harms the body, the lives of the people who worked in the mines, and why this case matters not just for history, but for how we think about corporate power and human rights today.
David, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for inviting me.
Sure. So before we dive right in, can you introduce yourself to our listeners and share a little bit about your background?
Yes, I'm a law professor, a human rights law professor at Sydney Law School in Australia. I'm originally Irish, went to universities in England and emigrated out to Australia 35 years ago. And really most of my life is involved in human rights, either teaching, research or practice. I do a lot of development and human rights work in developing countries in and around the Pacific, Asia, Southeast Asia and South Asia.
So your new book, In a Rain of Dust, Death, Deceit, and the Lawyer Who Busted Big Asbestos. Can you tell us what the book is about?
It's fair to say that the backbone of the book is this lawyer, Richard Meeran, who was a young, late 20s, early 30s lawyer in London, who himself is African, Indian, Anglo, been brought up there for experiencing the brutal playground accepted racism, as was the case in the United Kingdom at that time. He's a man with a burning passion for social justice, drove himself through law school. And this case involving black and coloured South Africans being exposed to asbestos levels in mines, mills, and the communities of South Africa for decades after asbestos was effectively banned in Europe, the United Kingdom, the United States, struck a chord with him, not only because of the racial dimension, but most of all because of the fact that the corporation had by then, this was the mid-90s, had by then left South Africa. South Africa at that time had just emerged from apartheid and therefore was struggling to stand on its own feet after that 50-year experience. And he felt that there was something that he might be able to do to help these thousands, possibly hundreds of thousands, but certainly thousands of people in South Africa who were suffering from asbestos-related diseases. So he decided to take the case on. The case is really, as I said, the backbone of the book. The law is there. It's an essential part of the book. He was told that there were major legal obstacles that he would never be able to surmount, but he did over 10 years. But around that skeleton of the book, there is a huge amount of human story, tragedy, triumph, misery, deception, skullduggery, heroes, heroines, and many of those who were the exact opposite of heroes and heroines. And it's those stories that I was most interested in relating in the book, because they give, I think, to the dry features of the law, they give them life. They make a reader, I hope, appreciate, maybe even empathize, put themselves in the position of the people who are encountering asbestos and then the litigation and seeking of social justice thereafter. So it's a long, I've got to say, involved story. I'd be interested to know what you guys think. But it's one that was a pleasure. It's an odd word to use, but it was a pleasure to try and piece together. It was like a jigsaw puzzle. I really felt at times that I was just faced with that, the box has just been emptied in front of you. And I know there's lots of really good stuff in there. And I know that the product in the end could be really quite dramatic and colourful and wonderful. How am I going to put that all together? So it took me 5 years to do it. But as I said, it was a very satisfying process. And I should say just one final thing. I think one of the reasons for that was because Richard himself was an extraordinary repository of stories that were legal, but also political, social, personal. He just has this amazing magpie memory for the bizarre, for the important, for the jaw-dropping, and all of that added hugely to the cornucopia of stories that I could weave into the broad arc of the book.
And I mean, the title is, it's eye-catching. It's what caught, our eye when we were looking at books and authors. So how did you come up with that title?
Lawyers and academics generally pretty boring titles. Was a sort of the inner sub-editor of me. What would USA Today say? What would a tabloid sub-editor say about this? But I think it captures it as well, because deceit is at the core of this. It's a simple negligence story, but negligence based on the fact that the corporations knew what damage their product was doing to their employees and to the communities around them, and they knew for decades. And it's the unraveling of that realization that they knew about this and yet nevertheless carried on employing these people and allowing the dust to circulate in their communities in a most devastating way that is sort of the core moral feature of the story, where one can barely believe that happened. And yet this is not fiction. This is non-fiction, and obviously a court case. So all of it fundamentally true. And that, I think, helped me be quite bold with this title.
And I think it's important that our listeners understand exactly what asbestos is and what it does and the issues that surround it, what it was used for. If you could just talk a little bit about asbestos, what is it exactly?
Some people thought that it was a vegetable. It's such a sort of fine-grained fibre that it may well have been mistaken for that. It's actually a mineral. Probably we all know that now. But it's a mineral of extraordinary qualities, and that was the reason why it became so commercially viable, particularly at the beginning of the last century. It was incredibly strong when it was woven. It was easy to weave. It was fire retardant, of course. It was chemically neutral. It had all these qualities that were necessary, as it turned out, for helping war machines. And both the First and Second World War really jump-started the commercial viability of asbestos. And thereafter, just like many things that are developed in war or heading to space, they then become part of you and me, our daily lives. And so asbestos, as I'm sure you and all your listeners know, is everywhere. And it's everywhere in the United States. It's in buildings. I'm much older than you guys, but I remember as a child in my chemistry and physics labs at school, we had a little asbestos plate upon which we put the Bunsen burner when we were sort of lighting up our chemical experiments. And that was in the classroom. But it was used in everything. It was used in all sorts of things, lagging, roofs, pipes, water pipes. But it was used in things as frightening as talcum powder and tampons. And you think, good God. Now that we know what the consequences are of asbestos, and particularly its fibre, these sorts of revelations of how ubiquitous it was really does, I think, horrify us. And what is most extraordinary about its good qualities, the ones that I have just mentioned, are also the things that make it so virulent. and so difficult to deal with for the human body. I must say I was intrigued by that chemical, scientific and medical dimension of the product. So I spent some time educating myself as to what asbestos fibre is and how it affects the human body. I thought that was a very important part of putting it in the book, because we were talking about people whose lives were being literally suffocated, taken away from them, destroyed. And I wanted people to know, as well as for me to understand, how that occurs. And asbestos fibre, particularly one type, the amphibole type, which is blue and brown asbestos, which I should just add, blue asbestos is mined, or was mined, in only two places in the world. One was Australia, but that was stopped many decades before South Africa, and the second was South Africa. And the other amphibole is brown asbestos, which was mined only in South Africa. So South Africa had this preponderance of the most dangerous form of asbestos. The fibres are incredibly small. They're aerodynamic in the sense that they are like a hypodermic needle, but incredibly small. They're what they call bioresistant or biopersistent. In other words, very hard to break down. And when they get past your otherwise very robust filtering systems of our nose, our mouth, our upper respiratory tract, which normally gets rid of nearly all the dust that we are encountering on a daily basis. Once it gets past those frontline defenses and gets into our lungs, that's where the real problem occurs, because it is so difficult to eliminate. It's so difficult to chemically break down. It's so small and so aerodynamic that it can literally pierce your lung into the lining of your lungs and your chest wall, which is supposed to be an utterly free of any contamination area, a thin pleural lining that allows our breathing that you and I are doing right now to be silky smooth as our lungs move up and down. So you put these tiny fibres in there, and of course they irritate. And we're not talking about one or two, we're talking about millions. And your body reacts by putting plaques around it, by sort of creating defense mechanisms like hard lumps of soapy-like material, which therefore inhibit your lung and eventually will, from the inside and the outside, remove your capacity to breathe because you don't have the surface area to take up oxygen and you suffocate. So I felt it was very important to take the reader from where the good, commercially attractive and indeed useful features of asbestos, take it from there to the position where God said that those qualities had a very dark side. That really is sort of the feature throughout the book, because once you got past the commercial viability and realized the dangers, the corporation should have acted, and they didn't. And that's the key, that's the fulcrum of the book.
So the way it kind of gets into one's body is just by breathing?
Well, yes, of course, but also by eating. You ingest it as well. So, I mean, amongst all the stories that you will have encountered in the book, people told me and told Richard 25 years ago. I mean, the case was in the 1990s. I did all my interviews in 2023. But across all that time, the stories were the same. People would talk about their windowsills being caked with fine blue dust, which is asbestos fibres. Biltong, which is dried meat that is a very big thing in South Africa, hung outside people's houses in the dry air, would be peppered with blue asbestos, and then they would eat that. So you're breathing it in and you're ingesting it. And as soon as it gets into either your digestive tract or your breathing tract, it can then spread to the rest of your body, which is the problem.
Are there any particular illnesses that people might have heard of that would be associated with asbestos?
Well, the most obvious and the gravest is mesothelioma, which is cancer of the pleural lining of the lungs. But in fact, it can reach brain. It can even get up to your brain. It can certainly get into your pancreas, to all your other organs, even into gonads. It can go everywhere. One of the most interesting things, one of those things that really floored me whenever it dawned on me what I was reading with these medical reports, which are usually very dry and very upfront. They don't have any color to them. The reason why you don't hear so much about people dying with a disease, cancer-related, asbestos-related diseases in organs other than the lungs and the heart to an extent, is because that's so ferocious an attack on those organs that you die before the body has time for it to reach the other parts. But for some people, it did. It did get into the lymph nodes and into the lymphatic system, and therefore finds other ways to get to other parts of the body. But it was incredibly robust and penetrative, the asbestos fibers, but it didn't really need to go that far, because once it attacked your lungs and your heart, there wasn't much hope for you surviving.
CAPE Plc was a British company. I guess still is, technically. It still does exist.
It does.
And, they used men, women, and even children to mine and mill this asbestos in South Africa for decades. But since asbestos had been around and people already knew the effects of it at the time and it was banned, how was it that CAPE was able to get away with this?
The banning didn't just happen overnight. One of the ironies of the fact that South Africans suffered so badly in respect of asbestos exposure is that probably the most important seminal research paper on the medical impacts of asbestos exposure was produced by 3 South African medics and scientists in 1961. Now, they, of course, had a wide body of subjects to study because lots of people were suffering in South Africa. But that information was published in a British industrial medical journal and caused a furore. I quoted a lot in the book, not least because of the 33 patients that they looked at. They describe in clinical, horrifying detail what was happening to their bodies. And so I quote that quite often, simply to make it clear that we're talking about a human being whenever these people are talking about drawing off a pint of pus from their lungs and threads of congealed pus out of their lungs in an autopsy. It's horrific stuff. Anyhow, that made it clear that there was a link between blue asbestos and mesothelioma. That was then quashed, queried. The scientists themselves were bullied by the asbestos industry in South Africa. And why? Well, largely because the asbestos industry was closely related to the political power that existed in South Africa at the time, which of course was apartheid. And so therefore, more easily than elsewhere, I'm not saying it was impossible for this sort of lobbying to occur elsewhere. It did in Europe, UK and the US. But in South Africa, it was easier to have the attention, to grab the ear of the politicians who realized that the vast majority of people that were suffering from asbestos were black and colored. Therefore, as I entitled one of the chapters, Black Lives Mattered Less. And that allowed, therefore, the muddying of the waters, of these medical waters, that allowed the muddying of those waters to continue for a lot longer in South Africa than it did in the rest of the Western world in any case, who picked it up fairly quickly, and the general public realized that this stuff was dangerous and as a consequence reacted and said, we don't want to buy this stuff anymore. And that is actually in the end what stopped the mining of asbestos in South Africa, not a concern for the lives of the men, women and children who were being exposed to it in South Africa, but because the men, women and children of the Western world didn't want to buy asbestos products anymore, and therefore the industry effectively petered out. But for those last 2 or 3 decades, the CAPE and other asbestos companies in South Africa squeezed the very last dollar out of the industry before they departed the country.
So they really didn't care about protecting their workers, and they also didn't really care about consumers and their exposure to asbestos.
That's right. There's affidavits and depositions that I quote for this case and other related cases in the book, which show that there was a real reluctance to even put warning labels, just a mere warning label on asbestos products, because they felt that that would scare their clients, scare the customer, and it would. There was a constant dialogue, let's say, between the asbestos industry in South Africa and the mining inspectors who were supposed to regulate them in South Africa, such that, and again, I spend time quoting these extraordinary statements from mine inspectors who effectively say the air was clean, there was no problems, there was a minimal amount of dust available in the air. It was an acceptable level of exposure, or words to that effect. Year after year after year, when all the medical evidence and all the scientific evidence coming out, not only of South Africa, but by then the rest of the world, was saying this stuff is lethal. So you realize that there was a real double standard going on here. South Africa was able to perpetuate this use, mining and milling and use of asbestos far longer than anyone else, and largely because the apartheid regime facilitated that discrimination.
What was CAPE mining this asbestos for?
For sale as raw asbestos, as it would be shipped out to the West. There was one asbestos company producing entity in Benoni, which is just east of Johannesburg, but so some of it went there. For the large part, it went overseas to be manufactured into all the things that I mentioned before, fire blankets and roofing and pipes under the ground, etc. Lagging for ships and for all sorts of other heat-producing machines. So that's what they were using it for. And the blue and brown asbestos was particularly strong and retardant. And so because it was only being mined in South Africa, they had a hold, as it were, over that part of the asbestos market. The other part, which actually is the biggest part, is white asbestos, which is mined still all over the world, in Uzbekistan, Russia, China, India, used in parts of South America as well. And as I say in the book, the argument is that it is less dangerous, and it may be, but it is still lethal. We're talking about just different degrees of lethality. It's not a question of one being safe and the other not. But yeah, that's what they were using it for. They were mining it, milling it so that it just became raw asbestos, and then sending it overseas for it to be manufactured into the products I've referred to.
You just said fire blankets, and that actually, hopefully it's not still in fire blankets.
Not anymore, no. But if it's a really old one, but then, no, they should have gone by now. But of course, it is in your buildings, I mean, just today, right? It happens all the time now. I'm very aware of it. But just today, the Reserve Bank of Australia, which is the equivalent of your Fed, has indicated that it's going to cost $1.2 billion for it to refurbish its entire building, stripped back to its steel frame, because it's a CBD, it's right downtown Sydney, because it's full of asbestos. Now, that would not be alone. There would be plenty of buildings in your country and my country in which that is the case.
Yeah, I mean, I know here in Texas, it's required in Texas that if there is it's required to test for it and you have to remediate it. But in, let's say, like New York City, if you find it, you can just pretty much just cover it back up and pretend like it's not there. As long as it's quote unquote secure, you can just keep going. And then you get like drywall products that are from Canada that still have trace amounts of it.
The Canadians, in fact, mined and milled white asbestos for a very long time. Indeed, only relatively recently, in the last 15 years, did they stop that. So that was a blot on your northern neighbour's copybook, I should suggest.
And you're a lawyer, but you wrote the book in a way that's very accessible to audiences without legal background. So how did you approach that challenge? Or was it even a challenge?
Oh, well, it was indeed. Thank you very much, Zoe. I can't tell you how much it is music to my ears to hear somebody say that. I'm not only a lawyer, I'm an academic, so that makes me doubly hampered. But it very much was my aim to do that. What inspired me to ask Richard, the lawyer, about the case and whether I could write a book about it was I was coming back from a course I was teaching in Nepal, and I was in a plane. And I watched, as we all do, a movie, and I watched Official Secrets, which is a British-American movie about a young lawyer who helps a young and an innocent member of the British Secret Services, a public servant, who reveals information about the way the US, the CIA in particular, is seeking to obtain any information it can that would implicate Saddam Hussein during the early 2000s to have weapons of mass destruction. And it really did feel to her that this was overstepping what they should be doing. So she reveals this. She's a whistleblower. But she then has the full power of the state brought down on her head. And this young lawyer, who's the same age as Richard, actually, Ben Emerson, a British lawyer, fights her case and wins. And it's a wonderful story. It's a great film as well. Keira Knightley plays it, and Ralph Fiennes is the lawyer. And at the end of it, I'm thinking, God, that's what law should be about. That's what I should be teaching, and what students should be inspired by, and anyone who reads about the law should be inspired by. So I was thinking, what lawyers do I know, certainly not me, that have done that? And Richard came to mind, who I've known for 25 years. And so as soon as I go back to Sydney, I rang him and I said, this case involving asbestos, which I had known about and teach because it's such an iconic case. And in 2 hours, he didn't stop talking, telling me about all these amazing stories, not only about the law, but strange things that happened to him and the politics of it, and funny things as well, dramatic things as well. Like he, as I say, is coloured black, and he went with one of his research assistants, who I also interviewed for the book, who's Caribbean, one day to do interviews in South Africa. So they flew out from London. And so he tells me this sort of story. When they arrived at their B&B, their accommodation, the guy who's their host has talked to them on the phone and written emails or something. So he hasn't seen them. And when he just thinks they're British lawyers, and he has an assumption about what a British lawyer will look like. And so when these two guys rock up to his front door, he opens the door and he goes, oh, just a minute. And he slams the door and runs out, and there's sort of movement and banging of doors and closing of gates. And he comes back and he says, okay, it's okay now. And they say, Richard said, what's the problem? So Richard is telling me this story. I haven't even decided to write the book. And the host says, well, we've trained our dogs to attack only black people.
I'm sorry, what?
We've trained our dogs to attack only black people. And I had to go and put them away. I had to lock them up. Richard and Dave Nietzsche is calling, go and stay there. But this is the sort of thing they encounter all the time. Now, I mean, that then became part of the story in the book. I mean, there's hundreds of stories like this in the book, but I interviewed Dave Nietzsche, who's this amazing barrister now, the huge bear of a man with dreadlocks, and he's a poet as well as a barrister. And he told me that he had written, immediately after that, a poem, indeed a rap song, called Racist Dogs. And so he gave me it. And so I quoted in the book, and he says, these racist dogs, man. That was the sort of thing that as soon as I realized that, because I knew the case well, I realized that all this stuff could be added to it. Now, that's just one example of many wonderful, crazy, sad, moving stories that Richard told me. I thought, this has got to be written. So that's how I came to write. And I was determined, having been exposed to those sorts of stories, first up from Richard. And he's a very serious lawyer. And so I knew I'd get the law okay. But I thought, I'm determined to get all of this stuff in, to make it absolutely human. And I've got to say, in my mind, I always had an image of how this would look. Forgive me for saying this, but how this would look on screen. I was always thinking, like, I can just imagine, how you would film that. These two guys appearing, and then this big Afrikaner going, oh no, I didn't realize you were black. So it was those sorts of things that drew me towards that style of writing, Zoe. And I didn't know whether I'd succeeded. It was a challenge, I can tell you. But I'm delighted to have somebody like you, who I don't think is a lawyer. Congratulations if you're not. And you're not an academic, I don't think. Again, congratulations. So I'm delighted to have people like you say that they found it readable.
You had said, lawyers like who Keira Knightley played and lawyers like Richard do these things. So, and not lawyers like you. Is this something that you would not have been able to do or want to do? Because it's a huge risk.
I'm not a barrister. I'm not a solicitor. I'm not a qualified lawyer in that sense in it. I mean, the practice that I do mostly is, I've worked a lot in developing countries, as I think I mentioned at the beginning, usually doing advice work and reports for aid agencies, the World Bank, and for Australian aid and UK aid and others, ADB. And so that's the sort of stuff I do, not litigation. So what I'm saying is I'm not a litigator. And you've got to be a qualified lawyer, of course, and hold the practicing certificate. And you've got to then have, the backup of a firm, even though Richard's firm, this is one of the extraordinary stories. Richard's firm was threadbare. There were 2 or 3 of them in a rent-free accommodation in the really poor end of Gray's Inn Road, which is in London, above a Communist Party bookstore who gave them the room for free. And that was the main reason. It was incredibly noisy. They had no heating, no cooling. It had a toilet that was blocked. And now they are this super attractive, cool glass and tubular steel law firm in downtown London. With 100+ lawyers. They've got hydroponic plants in their foyer. They've got doormen and doorwomen. I mean, it's just, the world is completely different, and largely because they had the guts to take on an impossible case and cases, not just this one, and they won. And people are inspired by that. Young lawyers want to go and work for a firm like that. They won't be paying them the same as the big Golden Circle law firms. They'll still be paid very well. Let's be clear, but they won't be getting paid the mega bucks. But they're doing something that gets them out of bed in the morning, makes them look in the mirror and say, I'm proud of what I'm doing. I really want to do this. It's that sort of thing that I wanted to capture, that litigating warrior. And I'm not that. I'm not a litigator. I'd like to think that I've got that sort of, warrior notion, but it's just not the way I present it through litigation. Richard, you would never think of as a warrior. He's quiet, self-effacing, demure. But my God, is he determined. I mean, he's like a dog that just locks its jaws on its prey and will not let go, come what may. Again, as I say in the story, it was hard. I mean, really hard. His wife is a doctor. They had 2 young children. They were struggling to keep ends met. He was just constantly away. She's an amazing woman, and I interview her. I know her very well in the book as well. And I wanted that to be part of the story so that, again, the readers of this don't just think of a sort of lone wolf. He needed the support of many, most particularly from his wife, who herself is this highly accomplished medical practitioner. It's all of that, trying to just weave it together and say, this is the real world of law and litigation. Rather than saying I could or couldn't do that, it's more, this is what happens. This is how it actually operates. And I think that, frankly, is what I hope is attractive to my students or to anyone who reads it, is that this is the real world. That may turn some off, but equally for others that may think, yeah, well, this is it. I'm going in, boots and all. This is not going to be easy, but it can be rewarding and satisfying, and it can make you feel that you've made a mark. I'd like to think that my incredibly bright young things that I'm teaching just last night, this is exactly what I want them to do.
Yeah, gutsy. Well, it's also gutsy to write about it. So, your part is integral, because how are people going to know about it unless you're in that realm, in that legal realm, in South Africa? It's a very small world, right? So, this case spans continents and many years and lots of interviews, lots of human stories. So what was your research process like? I think you had said it was about 5 years, so that's a long time.
It is. I mean, I had other projects on the go at the time, but that the mention of the film, The Official Secrets, was in early February 2000, so in the middle of, right just before COVID. And the book didn't come out until May this year. So it's effectively 5 years. But the main part of my research, I think, was really in the 2023, 2024. So really a 2-year heavy hit concentrated period. What was my process? Well, as an academic, you can't sort of shake off the academic credentials that you have and hopefully the experience that you have. And I really wanted that to be there. So as you may well have seen, I documented everything. It's all at the back of the book. It's all in the footnotes. But I was assiduous in everything that I read, whether it was medical, political, legal, trying to cover as much as possible. And there were thousands of documents, the legal as well as then the medical and the political. And it could have been an unending task. So I was trying my best to read enough to understand how the story might be padded out, how you might put the muscle on the bones, the meat on the bones, but not reading so much that I would make it a sort of Michelin man, because then it loses all form. So I was trying to get enough to think, right, now I know where the story is going. I can see that would emphasize that particular part of the story, move on to the next bit. And so, I mean, as I say, I could have spent a decade doing all the research on this, but I don't think I would have added a hell of a lot more in value. I may have just made it a bit too impenetrable. So my research was structure and strategy was formulating as early as I could without anticipating too much, but formulating as early as I could the structure to which then I would add specific stories and bits and elements. And those elements then I'd go out and search for. I think, all right, I need to find out more about what was in there in the mind of the management of CAPE during the 60s and 70s, after this medical evidence had been made clear. And so then I went to the National Institute of Occupational Health in South Africa and spent a week going through all their records, finding stuff that would indicate that the asbestos industry in South Africa had a very clear financial and physical, in the sense that they would come and visit, link to the National Institute, which is effectively a scientific, medical, academic entity. And yet they would go in there with money, with intent to make sure that whatever was being produced by these boffins, by these doctors and scientists, would not look too bad for their commercial interests. So they were really corrupting science. And indeed, I talk about that in the book. Indeed, to such a point that there was one document which I knew I was keen to find, just a short 4-page document produced in 1962 by one of the doctors in the National Institute of Occupational Health. And I knew it existed because it had been mentioned in the case by Richard 25 years before. And so I thought, well, the place I'm going to get the original of this will be in the National Institute, in its library, in its archives. I and the archivist spent the whole week trying to find this document. I was doing other stuff as well, but he and I, we couldn't find it. And the only conclusion we can reach is that it was removed. It was such an important document, caused such a furore amongst the industry, that they simply made sure that it wasn't available, at least not in South Africa. So one of the benefits I could bring to the National Institute was I got a copy from Richard because he had a copy in court, and I was able to give it to them and put it into their archives where it should be in the first place. But that just showed the sort of level of deceit, as in the title, they were willing to be involved in. So that digging deep, which I must say I find really interesting. At times you'd have to come up for air to make sure that you weren't going so deep that you were disappearing down a rabbit hole. Come back up and remember where this fits into the overall structure, and be cognizant of the fact that you've got another 9 chapters to do. So yeah, it was that process. But I think you interview a lot of authors, but once you get into the swim, you're just one-track minded. I was fortunate enough that I had a sabbatical. I went over to this little farmhouse in the Pyrenees in France. The population of 30 people in the village, so it's not much was going on. I would just get up early in the morning and I'd write until early in the afternoon, pretty much solidly. Then I'd take a break and then maybe do a wee bit in the evening. And that was it. And I just forced myself to write a certain number of words a day. And once I got all the research with me and get the thing out. So yeah, that's it in a nutshell.
Speaking of particular documents and kind of digging deep, was there any source of discovery that completely changed how you saw the story?
Now that is a good question. My main source, the guiding light to my research, was Richard, because I would have spent 250 hours interviewing him. I interviewed lots of other people as well, but they often came from me listening to what he had to say, and then I think, right, I'll go to South Africa and I'll interview her and him and her. But Richard would, in not necessarily a particularly ordered fashion, would tell me all these stories, often just organically. Would be talking about something and he'd say, oh yeah, and I remember this. And so I'd have these notes written down from my interviews with him, and they would be going in 7 different directions after an hour and a half. And then I'd sit down afterwards and think, right, okay, what do I do with this? And how do they fit with the other comments that he made to me, or somebody else made a comment, or something I'd read? But he did, in those interviews, on regular occasions, raise things that I would go, wow, that's a gotcha moment. He would probably know it, but I certainly, in the way I was picturing the story, would know, yeah, this is going to be key. Honestly, I'd say 5 or 6 of those moments in the book where something happens that makes you realize that this is emblematic of the broader picture. Even things like one day when he realized that having won an important appeal, that he is now going to lose a subsequent action that is brought against him for deceiving the court, which was bogus, and that he might be able to appeal that, but he would lose the appeal. And this was already 5.5 years into the litigation, and he reached a point of near despair. And I remember him telling me about this, and him telling me that he was sitting on the stairs at home. And this is so unlike Richard, with his head in his hands, late one afternoon. And even for him to say that to me is extraordinary, because he's not that sort of man. He never gives up. And so I could see that it really was affecting me. And he said that the door opened and his wife came in with his young daughter, who was 5 or 6. And she, of course, knows nothing about what's happening. And she just bounds up, jumps onto his knee and says, this appalling thing happened in the playground today, and I am, and she was so affronted by what, so he tries to get himself out of this stupor and talk to her. But his wife confirmed, she said, I really thought that he was done in at that stage. That he could have given up and nobody would have blamed him. So it was things like that. Not just the story when the House of Lords eventually find in his favour, which is an obvious high point, but it's also those sort of low points that are very personal, they're not public at all, that I thought were important to get across. And the way he would tell them to me made me think, just as your question indicated, of, wow, that's a key moment. That's a moment where this story really does take a leap up or down.
And what about you? Did you ever feel like you had to step away because the material was just so heavy at one point?
No, not really. When you're reading it and it's in front of you, there's a certain distance, isn't there, Shandy? So that in a way gives you that academic distance. But when I interviewed people in South Africa, it was very moving, and I say that in the book as well. I'm not in the book much at all, but just every so often when I'm interviewing somebody who was part of the story 25 years ago, and I say, she is sitting in front of me now in the following way, and one of them did sort of very incredibly dignified, sitting up very straight, holding herself very still, but I could see that there was a tear in her eye as she was telling me this particular story, and she was doing her best to make sure that that wasn't seen by me, but I could, and I thought, oh God, what this woman has gone through. Now, I didn't want to give up at that time, Shandy. I wasn't sort of thinking, oh no, I've got it. It was more, maybe even the reverse. I thought, geez, this is something I am determined. I'm going to get this done in a way that does her justice, No, I don't think I ever felt like I was going to give up. I thought I was onto something, and I really wanted to get it out of my system.
You write about poor, mostly Black South African workers. Some of them were children who were exposed to asbestos every day. So who were these people, and what did they look like? What was life like for them around the mine?
In particular, we spent a lot of time in Prishka, which is in the Northern Cape, which is sort of roughly between Cape Town and Johannesburg, and right in the middle of the country. And it's known as the mining area. There's lots of minerals there. It's relatively poor, incredibly dry, incredibly flat, featureless. If there's ever a hill, it's a big moment. Just long, straight roads. And there's not a lot there except for mining. So that's what people are subsisting on. They're subsisting on their employment in copper, uranium, aluminum, asbestos, previously asbestos. Dusty, dry, relatively still poor, full of the usual small-town politics with heroes like one of the doctors that I interviewed and his forebears in the hospital in Prishka, who documented what they were seeing on a daily basis with patients presenting with mesothelioma or asbestosis, and that documentation itself then being fed into the big end of town publications, including into into depositions that were taken by Richard's team for his case. For the people themselves, it was just normal. There was one woman who I interviewed in 2023, and who I saw again just 2 months ago when Richard and I went back to Prishka. Phillida, she's in it, a remarkable, wonderful woman. But she told me she remembers that she was a child with her mother, who was a cobber. A cobber, it was somebody who would take the raw asbestos rock, which is crumbly, and break it apart with their hands and small hammers outside the mine. The mine is they're just sort of small artisanal mines. We're not talking about big, deep ones, at least not generally. But they would be sitting outside, breaking up these rocks and taking out the fine fibers, getting rid of the rocks and putting the fibers to one side. Now, they would be doing this. Women were nearly always doing this because it was seen as women's work. It was fine, delicate, didn't require huge amounts of strength. It was more that you were persistent. And that was seen as good for the family because the men would be in the mines, the women would also be able to work. So that was seen as a boon at the time, two people working. And what's more, this outside work, which was not considered dangerous, there were no big machines anywhere, not at that time, you could bring your children. And so Phillida told me that she remembered as a child playing around her mother as her mother is breaking open this, with lots of other women doing the same thing, with piles of asbestos over here and the rock residue pushed over here. And these kids, her and all her mother's children, would be running around playing with the two piles. And she tells me this, and I put it in the book, she remembers rolling some of the fibers into fake cigarette and pretending to smoke these things as little kids. And yet they're putting in their lips raw blue asbestos. So they didn't know. They knew nothing about what was... of course, if you were a mum, you would not, and you thought this was dangerous, you wouldn't be saying, you wouldn't be allowing them to do that. So that the ignorance foisted upon them, the information denied them, is really what made their life what seemed at the time normal, but was in fact incredibly abnormal because it was killing them.
We've been talking about Richard Meeran, the central figure in this book. But who is he, and why did he decide to take up this case?
He's now 64. He was in his late 20s, early 30s at the time. As I say in the book, I tell a little bit about his story. He himself started out in a sort of commercial firm, but it just wasn't right. It didn't work for him. And then he saw Martin Day, who had just established the Lee Day firm, deliver a case or represent an individual in a courtroom that he was in the courtroom as well. And it itself was an extraordinary story. He was representing a rich Albanian expat who was complaining that he hadn't taken delivery of 2 Ferraris and he was wanting his money back or something. And Richard was there in the court, and at the same time, Martin Day, who was the partner of the firm that Richard was then to join shortly thereafter, was representing a young girl who had raced out to follow a football onto a street between 2 parked cars and been hit, and she was brain damaged. And they were trying to secure compensation or insurance for the girl at some level, like I can't remember the exact figures, but 30,000 or something, whereas Richard's client was looking for 500,000 sterling. Richard, I tell this story because I think it's one of those moments that Zoe was alluding to a moment ago. I tell the story that Richard talked to the Albanian and said, "Oh, look, sorry, we're just going to have to wait for a few minutes because this emergency case has come in. The judge has to hear it." And he says, "This is the case. This is this girl," and he explains what's happened to the girl. And the Albanian says, "God, that's all she's getting, and I'm after 500,000, and I've never even had the cars, and she's had her life taken away from her." And Richard says to himself, and then I say in the book, he couldn't have put it better himself. He thought, exactly, what the hell am I doing? Richard says, somebody else can represent this guy, not me. And so he ends up sort of moving across, coincidentally, as it turns out, to Lee Day, applies for the job. And it was a perfect fit for him. It was something that he could really pour himself into. He wasn't concerned about money. He should have been, he was just about to have, or was having 2 young children. Nevertheless, he was prepared to throw himself in. And as soon as he realized that this was for him, it was a good fit, that was it. And he's been there ever since. So he's a man of extraordinary integrity. You would think that having spent so much time with him, I knew him as a friend and a colleague, I suppose, but having then spent 2 years cheek by jowl with him, interviewing him every week by Zoom or when I was overseas seeing him, that I would sort of get sick of him or find fault in his life that, you think, oh, I really didn't know that. But honestly, I've got to say that I just think he's an extraordinary human being. I mean, he's not perfect, but I've been so amazed about how he holds it together. I just don't think I could do that. So the determination is how I would describe him first and foremost. Extremely smart, street smart. Like, he is a real strategist. He used a lot of the media in this to just weigh into CAPE with the moral story that was clearly on his side, not on their side. Willing to go the extra yard to find material. He loves to do the stuff himself. I think I referred to him at one point in the book as sort of Indiana Jones with a law degree. And that's what he was really like, heading off, doing all these weird, sometimes dangerous stuff, going into old deserted mines to find employment records, for instance. And I think he misses that now as he's got to an older age where he's got all these interns and clerks to do his work for him. And in a way, he would love to still be out there doing that, but he's a partner, a senior partner, so somebody else has to do it rather than him. That's the sort of character. He really genuinely cares about how to help these people. And he's still doing these sorts of cases. These are the sorts of cases he is still doing.
I think we all know that this kind of case is groundbreaking, but why specifically? Like, what made it groundbreaking?
It's a very good question, and it is important, lawyers and non-lawyers alike. And I don't think the law here is especially difficult. As I alluded to before, it is negligence-based. In other words, that he needed to mount a case that demonstrated that CAPE knew about the dangers of asbestos, that the people that were in their employ and those people who lived in and around their operations in South Africa were owed duties of care by CAPE. That is, CAPE must not do things that would endanger the lives of these people. If they did, they knew about it, and these people suffered damage as a consequence, in other words, their health was destroyed or their lives were taken, then you would be able to mount a claim of negligence and therefore seek damages. So that was the essence of what he was trying to demonstrate. Now, this is the little tangent that is important in the case, even for non-lawyers. Again, I don't think it's difficult, but it may sound a little complex. But I think it's clear that CAPE knew that evidence would be found by Richard. And indeed, he did find that evidence of negligence. And I could find it as I went through all the materials as well. So CAPE did not want a court case held in England that would have those negligence claims exposed, because they would lose, almost certainly. So what they did was to try and head off the litigation at the pass. And that meant saying twofold. One, this was not CAPE UK. We didn't do this. This was one of our subsidiaries, or a number of our subsidiaries in South Africa. So it's not us. And our subsidiaries have now long gone. They're no longer in South Africa. You can sue that empty vessel if you wish, but you can't sue us. We're back in England. And secondly, the proper forum, this is the legal term, the proper forum, the proper place in which you should pursue this negligence claim is not United Kingdom. It is actually in South Africa where the damage was done. Now, on both of those levels, CAPE had grounds to argue because the accepted precedent was in their favour. Yes, it should be the subsidiary that you sue because there's a corporate veil between a parent and its subsidiary. They are two separate entities. And secondly, the usual forum that you would expect to pursue a case like this would be the forum in which the damage occurred. So CAPE thought they were on good grounds. So what Richard did was to argue, no, this is the responsibility of CAPE UK because they had, in some form, and he had to demonstrate this, control over what was happening in South Africa and the subsidiaries. And secondly, it is in the public interest for a British company to be sued for these wrongful acts overseas in Britain, not to be sued in South Africa. What really made that important for him was that there was nothing to sue in South Africa. There were no assets held by the CAPE subsidiaries. They weren't there anymore. And what's more, there was no legal aid or no possibility in the 90s of those 7,500 clients getting any legal representation in South African courts. So that's why he really had to argue the jurisdiction argument. It's got to be in Britain. And so the vast majority of the case, in fact, all the way up to the House of Lords, it went to the House of Lords twice, but when it went to the House of Lords for the final time, it was all about jurisdiction. Is this case to be heard about CAPE Plc UK in British courts? And the final judgment by the House of Lords the second time in 2000 said yes. So that's why it was so monumental, Zoe, because what it did was to demonstrate that these previous almost impregnable barriers that corporations could hold up, saying, it's a subsidiary, nothing to do with us back here, and it's over there, go and sue them over there. They were torn down, or at least they were diluted, they were damaged. And so that made it a huge win for people trying to sue big Western companies for the damage that they were doing often in non-Western states. And as I say in the legacy chapter, the final chapter, there's been a host of cases subsequent to CAPE, particularly in the British courts, but elsewhere as well, which have simply embellished, have extended that argument. And they really owe their foundations to the CAPE case. So that's why it was so significant. And I should then finally say that's the law. As soon as that House of Lords decision was made against CAPE, shows how much they did know about the negligence and how much they would lose. They said, well, we're not going to go to court. We're going to settle. Because they knew if they went to court, they would lose. And perhaps They might not have to pay any more than they did in the settlement, but it would really look bad in terms of reputation, because all their dirty linen would be washed in public. So rather than going to court for the trial on the question of negligence, which is the whole point of the case, they thought that was settled, and we could do that effectively privately. But even there, all sorts of stuff was going on. A good 2 chapters in the book are about the skullduggery of those settlement negotiations. But that's the essence of the legal importance of the case, Zoe.
So does it just always come down to money? Is that the evil?
Well, one of my previous books is called Necessary Evil, Finance and Human Rights. So yeah, it's the necessary evil. Does it come down to money? Well, yes, but also reputation. It's also about redemption. Money was important for the corporations. Money was important for the individuals who suffered. But it wasn't just about money, because, as I say, the corporations wanted a reputation to be able to carry on, and they have. CAPE, ironically, is now a company that specializes in asbestos replacement product. So it puts stuff in our homes and factories and roads and institutions, and now somebody else is taking it out and they're putting asbestos replacement or substitute products in. The irony of that. But so CAPE, that was important. And for them, reputation and not just finance. And for individuals, yes, they did want compensation. But honestly, as important as compensation, they just wanted, and indeed couldn't quite believe, that a British white fella company could ever be held to account in Britain for what it had done to black and coloured men and women and children in South Africa. They couldn't quite believe that would ever happen. Surely all the odds were stacked against us, and they were right, they were, but it did. And I think there's no doubt that's another one of those trigger moments, Zoe, in the book that you asked me a moment ago. They couldn't quite believe that the settlement meant that they would get some money, not a lot, but they would get some money. To them, the fact that it wasn't a court judgment to say you have been negligent was immaterial. They just said, well, CAPE is giving us money, so that can only mean one thing. They recognize they did wrong. And they did wrong in a way that is public. Letters have been written about this, articles have been written about this, now a book has been written about it. So clearly they did wrong. And that is almost as important as finance, as compensation.
So Richard definitely encountered many challenges and obstacles. So what were they? And also, did you face any resistance in trying to get this book to life?
For Richard, yes. Most particularly, I alluded to this a moment ago, most particularly because after it looked like he was going to win, which was the first 2 hearings, in the first couple of years of the litigation, looked like it was going in his favor. At that point, he was just representing 6 people. Everyone knew, the lawyers on the other side, CAPE, the judges that had heard the case thus far, everyone knew that there were thousands, perhaps hundreds of thousands of people behind them that could have exactly the same claims. And indeed, after they won the first Court of Appeal case, they started to bring on more plaintiffs. Thousands, indeed. In the end, it turned out to be 7,500. Now, this would seem, even for lawyers, to be obvious, and some of the judges even said as much. And the other side lawyers admitted this as well. But the other side lawyers CAPE's lawyers decided to play dirty, because there was at least a prima facie argument to make that Richard was now changing the nature of his case from being simply plaintiffs into a class action. Now, that itself is not necessarily bad unless you have, it might be claimed, deceived the court by saying, here are 6 people, and then as soon as you've got your judgment, bringing in everyone else from the wings. And that is a very tenuous argument to make, but it just might work, CAPE lawyers thought. And so they impugned Richard's legal integrity and standing. So they went for him. They played the man rather than the ball. It was dirty. It was really dirty. And he had to face up to a disciplinary board to be examined as to whether he had done this. 2 courts that followed it, a lower court and then a Court of Appeal, found against him. And only then, by then, 7 years into it, when it got to the House of Lords for the second time, did the House of Lords find in his favour. So that period was incredibly dangerous. It could have destroyed the case on grounds that were spurious, specious, and it could have destroyed him. his career, because being impugned to have misled the court, even though he hadn't, was a huge issue. And I go into detail in the book about this and the various elements that could have saved him that didn't, and how near he came, and the case came to collapse. Because I think it is so important, and it's also a dramatic story to tell. So that, I think, was his hardest part, and I think he became a stronger man as a consequence of getting out of that. But certainly it was a huge blow, and he was a young lawyer. He was in his early 30s at this stage. He didn't have the backup that he has now. For me, no, I did approach CAPE's lawyers, but yes, I suppose I was going to say politely, they brusquely told me they were not interested. As soon as they knew that I was writing it with or using Richard, they weren't anything to do with me. I haven't heard anything from them since. They must know about it, I would imagine. It'll be interesting to see if there's any response from CAPE. It's a very different company now, but no, I didn't have any resistance. The people that I approached to interview were all very keen to do so, even if they were mostly the victims, as it were, people that were involved in the case, rather than the other side. CAPE, I didn't even approach, other than they were not the people there. I've got nothing to do with what happened 40 years ago in the 70s and 80s. The publishers were fine. Johns Hopkins were fine. They liked the idea of it. So no, I didn't really encounter any problems. It was really just collecting the material, and that just took a lot of legwork and writing and thinking.
Did this case help change the conversation about corporate accountability and human rights?
A very good question. Yes, it did. And I think it's an important point to get across to students as well. Indeed, I try and do that in the legacy chapter, not just students, actually, to all of us, to you and anyone who's interested. Because the feeling is, and both Richard and I belonged to this very small group of business and human rights people in the early 90s. There was hardly anyone looking at this. Richard was doing it in litigation. I was writing about it, and about 4 other people were writing about it. That was it. Almost nobody. Now it's a huge industry. Every corporation will say that it has got cognizance of international human rights law. Often they will say, we recognize the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, although I don't really know what that means in law. But anyhow, in terms of their responsibilities, there's the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. There's been a raft of cases across the world in civil code countries as well as common law, including the United States, in which business and human rights are now a common conjoined argument. Now, all of that would have happened, but it wouldn't have happened in the way it has happened had it not been for the CAPE case. Because CAPE opened up, as I said a few moments ago, this possibility of arguing in Western courts like the District Court of Columbia, like London, like in the Paris courts or in the Netherlands, that companies belonging to those countries doing bad stuff overseas can be sued back home. Even if it's a subsidiary, even if their relationship with the subsidiary is at arm's length, but still some connection, like, they set the global health policy for the group. And if they set the global health policy for the group, even if it's implemented by the subsidiary, then that means they've got some sort of control, some sort of responsibility for the health consequences. So those sorts of things now are accepted. Case law has been developed such that is now known. And if you look at the big law firms' websites now in this area, they will be saying, think who their clients are. Their clients are the big end of town, the big oil firms and tech firms, whatever. They'll be saying, what you do overseas can now be sheeted home to you and your responsibilities in the courts in your home jurisdiction. We will advise you about how to avoid that. Now, I'm hoping they're advising them, of course, in a way that means they're doing good, but they're clearly aware, both the big law firms and the clients themselves, that this is not an issue. Now, that was not the case, not at all the case 25 years ago. So that's a movement in the right direction. I mean, it's a money-making exercise. These big law firms are being paid a lot of money by these big corporations to be given that advice as to how to avoid this problem. I may sound churlish in saying that, but it is moving in the right direction. That means corporations are at least aware of their human rights footprint and what it might mean in terms of their reputation and indeed even their prospects of litigation involving human rights claims.
Richard rattled them.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. I think that's a very succinct way of saying it, Shandy, rather than my 5-minute spiel.
On a last note, what do you hope that readers take away from reading your book, In a Rain of Dust?
To be inspired. not just lawyers, but certainly lawyers, but those who are moved by the needs to see more justice, more fairness, more awareness of the plights of others. And those who are inclined may feel that they're often pushing a very big rock up a hill, and they probably are. But that should not dissuade them. You can do this, even if it seems like you'll never get the rock to the top of the hill. And even when you get there, you realize that the hill wasn't that big and there is another one beyond it. You are adding to what I think are valuable parts of what humans can do on this earth. And I think that the story of Richard and of the people involved, not just of Richard, but the many people involved, both the good and the bad, indicate to the reader how she might want to act herself and make her reflect on what she is doing or he is doing. And I hope that inspires them. I hope they enjoy the read as well and learn something from it. But most of all, that it inspires them to take action in that sort of way, like Richard did.
I think it's a good push forward. Richard started the domino effect, and many things have passed since then. Like you said, it is still hard, rolling up the hill.
Thank you, David, so much for taking the time to speak with us about the book. It was great to learn so much about the history of the asbestos industry, obviously politics and business practices, going back to apartheid and just, learning about the case in general.
Well, thank you for reading it. Thank you for having me on as well. Thank you for the questions.
Thank you, David.
We're so grateful to David Kinley for joining us and sharing this powerful story.
His book, In a Rain of Dust, Death, Deceit, and the Lawyer Who Busted Big Asbestos, is a reminder of the real human cost behind corporate decisions and the courage it takes to fight back. You can find the book anywhere books are sold, and we'll also drop a link to it in the show notes.
That's going to do it for this episode of Bound by the Cloak. You can find us on social media, X, Threads, Instagram, and you can find us wherever it is that you get your podcast. We'll be back again in 2 weeks with a brand new episode. Thanks for listening.
Until next time.